Thank you all so much for joining us. We had a fantastic panel earlier today looking at sort of innovation in clinical trials, which we'll obviously touch upon a bit today here. But this is also an opportunity for us to think a little bit more broadly about innovation, trust, technology, partnerships, and how we take the COVID experience and really build on it for the future. So I wanted to start with Rasmus. So Rasmus and I have got to know each other through COVID because, as you probably have ever read a chart that says anything about vaccines in the FT, you'll see the little tagline at the bottom that says, data from Airfinity. And Airfinity has been fantastic collecting vaccine data. And I wanted to start with you to say, how do you think COVID has accelerated innovation? And also the opposite, there might be areas where you think it hasn't.
Yeah. Thank you, Hannah. And I'd also start out saying you've done some great reporting in the COVID space, and FT has done amazing work there. When I think about what we saw in COVID, really we saw an industry and an ecosystem coming together and basically doing in 1 year what normally takes 10 years, right? If you look at the vaccine space, an average vaccine is around 10 years in development from beginning to approval, and that's kind of what the industry achieved in 1 year, which is frankly just remarkable, right? And that took innovation across the entire value chain, from data collection, basically also on the production level, and all parts of the value system kind of came together. And I think one of the things that I'm concerned about is, are we really using that experience now, or are we going back to normal in an industry and starting to slow things down, or could we take some of the learnings? And if I was to say one learning that we definitely have seen, and I think we can take further, is around testing and availability of data, right? Because this rapid acceleration was only possible because all of that data was possible. But at the peak of COVID, we had around 17 million tests done a day, right? So we really had a completely global understanding of how is this disease spreading. And that's, by the way, very correlated to genomic sequencing. So we also had a very good sequencing understanding, which meant that these hundreds, and I really I think when you look at 700 companies still in the COVID space, both pursuing therapeutics and vaccines. So all of these companies have access to this amazing data set, and also the researchers around the world were willing to put the data free, not put it behind paywalls. The protocols and the trials were available for free. All of that just made decision-making, I think, at all levels much faster and much better. So how do we do that in other areas? And if you look at, just to take the testing example, right now we only have 2 million tests done a day. And over the last months, we just see a rapid decline. So even in COVID, which is still a big issue, we have lockdowns in China, etc. We might have a new wave in the fall in the Western Hemisphere. So it's a real significant threat still. We actually to start to fencing in the blind again. We don't know, by our estimates, it's like 90% of all cases are not detected in COVID today.
Wow, that's a huge number, 90%. Yeah. And it's so interesting because there was this moment where everyone said, everyone's going to invest in diagnostics. We're going to have a kind of visibility of the disease landscape that we haven't had previously. And you're saying, one sec, let's actually make sure we capitalize on what COVID taught us how to do. That's really important. So John, you obviously work in clinical trials. We saw this in, about to say insane, but it kind of was insane acceleration of clinical trials during COVID. How do you think that we'll learn from that? Because obviously that's not something not every product is a COVID vaccine. What can people take from that, both in terms of speed and also inclusivity?
Yeah, there's a lot we learned, right? We went from getting frantic calls from people who said, I don't believe you should do anything in someone's home, to, okay, I believe you, how do you save my business in Italy next week? Overnight, right? And so that's really what we had to deal with. And what I would say has really happened is now we've had 2 years of people perceptionally having to move their perception forward because the regulatory guidance and support was there, the technology was there. Patients actually think what we're doing today in modern clinical trials and decentralizing is normal. When you actually ask them, they say, well, why wouldn't you send me to a clinic 25 times? Why wouldn't you bring this to my home? So all the things are there. It's actually a lot of us that were some of the barriers to getting there. What I would say, though, is as we look at what's been changing recently, and we look at the last 6 months, a number of the decentralized studies that were hybrid are still staying, But what you're seeing now is an increased push in customers coming and saying, here's my portfolio. How do I think about these studies in a very patient-centric way first? And then second is, in that patient-centric model, how hybrid or how decentralized should my study actually be, right? And so we have some studies where 2 of these visits in the home and 10 in the clinic is the right fit for that particular population, that particular study. But on the other, you've got maybe those 10 visits stay at home and only 2 come in the clinic. But it's a fit for purpose look. And what I would tell you has changed on the inclusivity side is there's still a lot of talk and a lot of PowerPoint around being inclusive and co-creating. And I hope we can all admit that, right? That when you actually look at it, we're really helpful. We want to do this. But when it comes to brass tacks every day, working with more than 200 customers, most R&D teams come in and say, yeah, I'm supposed to do that, but I don't really have time. Can I skip it, talk to one patient, and move on with my protocol? And so one of the things we developed at Thread was helping our customers to co-create by actually working directly with patients, having their voice be heard, not just in mixed method surveys, but actually their real voices, and then playing back all the voices in the studies from all the caregivers, patients, home health nurses to actually help people hear what their stakeholders are actually telling them to do and change and modifying protocols. And that's what we've really seen to drive inclusivity, because inclusivity is not about asking a question and then doing our own thing. It's about listening, doing something about it, and going back out and saying, does this look right? Can you give me more feedback? And I think that's really where it starts and where we're starting to see the movement as we sort of get into this new phase post-pandemic.
That's such a good example of how, of sort of I would say this as a journalist, but the power of narrative, right? That the data is part of it, but that if you can hear those people's voices, then it comes across how you need to adapt what you're doing.
Especially, like, the best example I have quickly is this Parkinson's example. Customer came in and said, this is how we're going to do this study, and we want you to decentralize it. And we said, well, that visit 2 and visit 4 isn't going to work. And they said, well, we've done it this way for 30 years. And we said, well, can we ask patients? And so we enrolled a panel, did a mixed method voice and Likert scale survey in 4 days, enrolled all the patients and caregivers, and then brought the customer back and said, okay, don't listen to us, listen to the patients. And we clicked play. Our AI algorithm pulled all the concern language together, and it walked them through, and actually the customer got to hear the patients and caregivers say, I'm not going to enroll in your study, I will not show up for your visit 2, and I will not do this assessment in your protocol. That's what actually unlocked and changed the perspective to say, okay, patient-centric, as we heard you, what can we do different? And that's really where I think the unlocks are starting to happen.
That's so interesting. And the other thing that we have, already was starting before the pandemic, but seems to be accelerating, is the perhaps even admission for some companies that you need to partner, that you don't actually have everything in the house. And I wanted to start with you, Brent, on this. I mean, we're really used to pharma, obviously, partnering with biotech, and I want that asset soon, please, thanks. But what about sort of more ongoing partnerships with different kinds of companies and sort of thinking about them more broadly to accelerate innovation?
Yeah, so I'll apply it to what we do at Ferring, which is primarily in fertility. And what we've seen over the course of the last couple of years is, out of necessity, there has been an increased focus on how you can integrate those partnerships. We're looking primarily at the patient, and what we can do to find various partners that can help us from a social media standpoint, and that will enable us to bring in these companies that can give more credence to some of the things John was talking about, and getting that patient voice into our clinical trials, into our commercial models, and that's really where we're spending our energy in this area.
And are you finding it's paying off?
It's early days, but so far so good. I'll give you one very quick example. We recently partnered with a company that's really a patient community platform in infertility, which really started as a commercial marketing type thing, and it's ended up, that company's now working with our R&D or our development group in helping patient recruitment, because patients didn't really understand. This group had clinical consultants that were working for them, and it's helped in recruitment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's great. So Frank, you at Sanofi have been doing all sorts of partnerships. Why don't we start with what you're doing with academia? Right? how do you work well with them?
Yeah, I mean, partnering is really in our DNA. I think we're totally subscribed to an open innovation network. We can't do this alone. I'm always saying we're 1X, and there's 1,000X out there, or there's 1,000,000X out there. So about 1/3 of our portfolio is partnered, and with my own background as a clinical academic, I'm extremely excited about partnering with the best in academia. We're signing over 400 CDAs, per year to really get into very deep discussions. But I give you an example. Really following very important medical questions. For example, in asthma, respiratory with Dupixent is a massive unmet need. And 10 people die from asthma every day, actually. And how it works is that you come to your intensive care unit with the attack. And this is what then, when the point of no return has happened. So we engaged actually with Mount Sinai, with the respiratory department, and with Eric Schad, who is a very bright data scientist, actually, to ask, can we do this differently in asthma? Can we actually do real-world monitoring of asthma patients with digital devices? And we have that, for example, a digitally enabled, Bluetooth-enabled respirator, so you can measure how these patients breathe. We have other digital devices like, for example, an iPhone, which essentially says what kind of environment were they exposed to. And you create this time series of data, which allows you ultimately to think about a digital biomarker. Can we have a digital biomarker with a device you actually carry around where you can predict that asthma is happening and then actually intervene before it happens? And this is essentially disease interception. Another collaboration with MIT, for example, with Dina Katabi, we're thinking a lot about atopic dermatitis. We heard this morning how terrible a disease this is. And it actually happens during your sleep. It's the itching and scratching during the sleep, which actually ultimately induces the disease. And with Dina Katabi at MIT and Emerald, we actually were moving from wearables to what's called invisibles. Now, just listen to me. You all have a wireless router in your home. Now, this wireless router sends out radio waves, but you can use these radio waves also to measure actually movements in a room next door. And with Emerald, we are actually embarking on a clinical trial where we're measuring the itch scratch behavior of patients and using that as a predictive factor of clinical outcomes. So a very interesting future.
So you get to like plug into the router and
so basically you have
work out how they're scratching at night.
So literally, I mean, you can't use your Xfinity router. I mean, that's no plugging for Xfinity here. But essentially, you have the same technology, which is wireless, goes through walls, and then you have an AI ML algorithm, which essentially detects a signal of movement when you scratch at night, and you quantify that and use that as a potential clinical endpoint.
Wow, that's fascinating. Although, yeah, personally, I find don't touch the router, otherwise it's going to go wrong.
And I think what it also does is we heard a lot about distributed clinical trials. We heard a lot about diversity, including people who would not come to a hospital. You can do this at home. So you can be included in a trial with these technologies and really moving the needle in terms of inclusive clinical trials.
That's amazing. That's really going beyond the Fitbit, isn't it? So Rasmus, during COVID, we saw, of course, a huge amount of public-private partnerships. I mean, what do you think the lessons are that we can learn from that? And are they just sort of for emergencies, or should we be extending those further?
I definitely hope that it's not only for emergencies, but we will keep some of those partnerships. I've seen there's been a lot of discussions around the clinical trial, which is a really interesting aspect. But I think another critical one is around the supply chain. So one of the things we saw in COVID early on was that it was impossible to scale up at the speed that the world needed, right? So, and every pharmaceutical company had the same problem. You know, how do we get the vials? How do we get the syringes? How do we get the lipid nanoparticles? You know, all of those things. And I was quite impressed to see the industry actually coming together through some of the industry associations and trying jointly to figure this out and jointly to map out the entire ecosystem. They couldn't have done that without the governments. And I think we're seeing a lot of discussions now around these kind of production networks around the world, which will enable us come the next pandemic, or also for many other areas, to rapidly scale up production. And I think it makes a lot of sense for a pharmaceutical company to say, listen, let's partner up, right? Because we all need the same sub-suppliers, and we need the government also to invest in some of that initial production line. So I think there's an immense amount of learnings, but back to my previous point, I'm somewhat a little bit concerned that we then go back to the normal kind of everyone in our own silo, and then we won't have that 10x acceleration, but back to the old way of working, and that would be, I think, a tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, as a journalist, actually, feels a very important moment to keep some of this stuff, maybe not literally on the front page, but as high up the agenda as possible, because what you're talking about production, of course, we're already seeing some people rolling back pandemic preparedness, extra capacity in other countries. So I'd love to move on to think sort of slightly earlier in the process, more R&D. And Frank, you spoke with me recently for a piece that I wrote about AI for drug discovery. So before it gets to clinical trials, and you have this idea of an AI research factory. And I wanted to know, how you sell that to your scientists and what it actually means.
First, I think just a few comments. Number one, we're really moving from a small data environment with conventional statistics to a large data environment. Especially in R&D, we're thinking about a genome with 2 billion base pairs. We have 500, hundreds of thousands of different genetic variants we can measure. We're looking at single cell genomics where we're measuring 2,000 genes per cell. So it's a massive data environment. And with simple statistics, this can be simply not handled anymore. And there's a world out there which uses machines to learn and to use predictive models from these data. Now, to be successful, you have to triangulate 3 important elements. One is you need a great algorithm, a great analytics tool. And I think we made great progress from the early days of machine learning, support vectors, classification approaches, to actually now generative AI, where you literally hallucinate a new molecule, and that's happening in the lab as we speak. But you also need ultimately great computing power. And I just was yesterday actually listening to a talk by Jensen Huang from NVIDIA, basically showed a new supercomputer where in the old days we had 100 parameters we could essentially compute. Now we can sit back and buckle up. We can actually measure and compute 500 billion parameters. So it's incredible what you can do, but the most important thing of this triangulation of data and compute and algorithms is actually the data itself. And there we're often falling short. And we heard in the previous panel how you can create data lakes where essentially data are then collected in a fair manner. They're findable, they're accessible, they're interoperable, they're retrievable, and they're standardized and they're annotated. And it's this creation of data sets we're going after in the AI Research Factory, actually across research and development. And I give you just an example. The industry currently, in terms of its productivity from return on investment perspective, is really in the single digits. We have to do better in terms of economics. Still takes 10 to 13 years and 1 to 2 billion to launch a drug in a CVS and get it to a hospital near you. Now, how can we change this? One way is to use large data analytics like machine learning and actually think about a molecular design perspective where we go from using 5,000 molecules, which you typically do at the moment, to 500 molecules to get a clinical candidate. And to apply then essentially a timeline, which is stubbornly, we compare ourselves to, and we had some of the best pharmaceutical industry representatives here, stubbornly it takes 4 to 5 years to get a clinical candidate to patients for testing. Now with AI algorithms, we can do this faster, and we can think about doing this instead of 4 to 5 years, we can do it in 2 or 3 years. Now if you have patients waiting for a drug, if you have a society which is really not happy with the economics of the industry, this is a way to really change and transform the industry as we speak. And we're on this way. We're partnering with the best, like Excensia, a company out of Oxford, who has done that, who has shown it's possible. And we'll see where we are. I hope in another FT Biopharma event, we can talk about some more of the proof points.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that was really interesting from that piece is that the industry is doing such really different approaches to using AI in drug discovery. But of course, cutting the time still means we have to wait for the proof point. You know, the drugs that are discovered that are by AI on the market are still not there yet.
Yeah, and then I also have to say AI means different things to different people. You know, you probably all use your AI to find the appropriate pictures in your iPhone, or you use it like I do. If I want to translate, I work for a French company. I translate a poem from Rimbaud from French into English. Surprisingly accurate. This is where AI works. Now,
I'm not using it to translate poetry, but I think that's great.
Can I use it as full self-driving car experience? Even Elon Musk has so far not achieved that goal. Can I use it as artificial general intelligence? Certainly not. So there's like, what do you mean if you talk about it?
So Brent, how are you using sort of digital innovation, and are you as optimistic as Frank about how you can cut these sort of timelines to approval?
Yeah, I think so. I think I share Frank's viewpoints on the promise, the future promise of AI. But at its core, I think we're trying to integrate as much as we learned over the last couple of years. Rasmus was talking about this, of compressing that time frame for development. And there's been good promise there. And I also want to make the point that I think even on the non-clinical aspects of the utilization of machine learning and AI, we see a lot of promise in what can be, or what will be, a better intersection of all the stakeholders in the continuum, whether it's patient, caregiver, manufacturer, regulator, et cetera. So I think it's still future promise by and large, but generally speaking, I think I feel good about where we're going to go, and I think we'll see a good result.
Rasmus, I get the impression that you're not quite as sold on AI. Tell us your views.
Wow, yeah, no, that's a dangerous view here, I can hear. But no, I think if you look at what happened in COVID, I think it's fair to say that we were probably AI overpromised and underdelivered to some extent. I think before COVID, would we have asked, would a DeepMind, would an IBM Watson, would they have come and kind of solved this pandemic for us? Probably, we would have thought that they would have played a big role. And I think we've seen an absence of many pure play AI companies in the space. And I think the key reason for it was really that the data just wasn't there. There wasn't the training data that you needed. And also it's a pandemic that goes like in really unexpected turns, right? So when tomorrow looks very different from yesterday, there's a challenge to all algorithms. So, but on the other hand, of course, some of the things that are said in the panel are also totally true. I think, for instance, with genomic sequencing, we can soon develop AI solutions to better detect a variant of concern and potential vaccine escape and some of those things. So I think it holds a lot of promise still. But I think it's fair to say that in the pandemic, it's more been kind of man has played a bigger role than machine, I think, in solving some of these issues, and maybe we'll get, further down the line, more kind of equal between man and machine. But I don't think we'll ever have in the life science space a full kind of machine learning automated development approach. I think there'll always be a role for critical thinking, looking at the patterns where they don't hold, brilliant scientists that think outside the box, and but I think they can live side by side.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. When I was writing that piece, I went through my old email, because obviously we get a lot of PR email, and to see all the sort of March 2020 emails about how AI was going to find the drug. And obviously it played lots of roles in really interesting ways in sort of making processes more effective, but it didn't press a button and find a drug. John, where do you come down on the debate?
Yeah, Rasmus, I want to give you some hope, actually. So I agree. I think in our perspective, we found 7 use cases that we thought could actually apply AI and solve a real challenge that our customers have. Right? We all know this. I also acquire companies. I acquired 3 in the last 8 months. If you want to get your valuation of your company up, you just put AI at the end of your statement and move on with your life, right? So we all got pitched a lot of AI. Here's what we did about it and what we're learning. We partnered with a little company called Amazon and Amazon Web Services and did a very public collaboration with them, some that's public and a lot that's not public yet, about what we're doing for applied machine learning algorithms and AI components that will actually drive 7 of these use cases. And one of the use cases I want to give you, because I think it's really interesting, is we built a predictive analytic model because we had done over 200 decentralized studies in 60 countries. And then we went out and took existing traditionally designed studies, around 1,400 of them. We did public publications of the data and compared the data and looked at recruitment and retention metrics descriptively and predictively over the course of 2020. And you could actually see where studies that were more inclusive, but studies that were more decentralized, meaning less visits in clinic as opposed to home or on the go, performed better and were more resilient. So when everybody's talking about resilience, the only publication people were citing was that one because no one was willing to publish their data. So when we went out and used the AI to actually do some work to publish with, it became a very valuable point for us to show where it worked and where it didn't work. The other thing that I want to mention, though, is changing is, have you ever seen GPT-3? I mean, I know you guys know it, but GPT-3, if you want to scare your family, just look up GPT-3 models on YouTube and show it to them. GPT-3 is part of Musk's OpenAI platform, and we've been using it in 2 of our tools for a couple years now. And one thing that GPT-3 does, it's an active AI that actually pulls keywords together, and then you can have conversations with it to query the data, and it looks for trends that are different than what we normally see. So it's kind of like, it's not a data scientist yet, it's like a data scientist toolbox, is kind of how I would describe it. And so when you go in and say, how many patients were non-responsive to this, or how many patients told me they were scared of visit 4, it goes throughout the data and pulls all the keywords back and puts them in Instagram stories and then reflects that for you to look at. And so a lot of times these AI use cases, I think everybody's thinking that we're going to click a button and it's going to go look at the data and say, John, the answer's 3, and you should change your entire business and hire these 20 people. That's not the reality of today. The reality of today is we use AI to help us solve a business challenge. And if you haven't seen it solve that business challenge, you're talking to the wrong people, because AI is solving business challenges. We're just having to train people and educate them about what it can do, but also where it doesn't have the confidence intervals that we need just yet. And so maybe that's the hope I'd give is that there's measured balance in where this goes. And as Frank mentioned, there's a lot to do here, a lot more coming, and some exciting stuff on the horizon.
All right, you've pepped us up again. Before we move on to the next question, I just remind the audience, both here and in the imaginary cloud, that I will take questions pretty shortly, so get them ready. But now I'd like to talk a little bit about, once you've got your drug approved and you're on the market, and I'm going to start with Brent here, like what are some of the latest sort of enablers that you're using for your commercial operations?
Well, I think while this is an idea that's been around for a long time, we're really now seeing the integration of multiple data sets to get a 360-degree view of both patient as well as caregiver, and that's enabling us to customize our approach to whoever's in that value chain, and I think it's making the commercial model much more efficient. So while this is an idea that's been around, it really had never materialized. And I think one of the effects of COVID out of necessity was people were forced to look for new ways to deliver care and for patients to consume care. And that's forced us into a situation that I think caregivers are the conditions are right to combine these data sets and get a 360 view of the physician as well as the patient. And you have a receptive audience as well. So I think the combination of those things is leading to many different accelerants in the way that care is provided. So I'll give you one example. In infertility, there's a point in the IVF cycle that a patient is required to go back to the physician historically 3 and 4 times a week. Highly inefficient. During the pandemic, we were forced to take on a new model, and a lot of this care was done remotely, and it continues that way because there were efficiencies gained and the quality of care did not suffer. So I think those types of examples where people have proven to themselves that there are other ways to deliver care, and utilizing the technology, manufacturers like us can help assist that.
Well, that's really interesting. Yes, hopefully poor people won't have to keep going back 3 or 4 times a week. That sounds like a bit much. John, what about you? What key innovations are your customers adopting after the pandemic?
There's a series of tools, but I would say that really where we see our customers, there's a part of them that are starting to say, okay, this is what a modern clinical trial, a patient-centric study looks like to us, and we want to lean into those tools. So whether it be more eCOA through telehealth to reduce visits, whether it be sort of different solutions. But what I would say we're seeing the most of right now is a large group moving to where they're actually starting to implement this at an enterprise level, meaning they're saying across our organization, 25 to 30% of our organization is going to do a study in this design and this fit for purpose model. And so what I would tell you is what that's bringing in is not the sort of proof points or the data or the AI tools. It's bringing forward a model that's going to require a lot more change management in the organizations. And so this idea of scale and decision making and how do I actually do this same design in my next 30 studies and next 60 studies is actually some of the bigger challenges we're seeing right now. And we've got one customer who's committed to 100 studies over the next 3 years. They're on study 35. They just got to where they launched their first, was a 3B study. They launched the entire study in 3 weeks, but it took them 4 years of pre-decisions and approvals to get to that point. And now they're just starting to get ROI. So I think what a lot of this, I think, right now is around perseverance and change management, because perseverance to know we've invested, we're doing this, and we got to keep leaning in to get that ROI, but also not expecting that it happens overnight either. And I think that's really reality of what we're dealing with. The tools are working, the ways to be patient-centric are there. This is about how do we effectively scale and get people in our industry to shift and make that possible.
Yeah. And Rasmus, obviously, we've relied a lot on you for telling us what the expectations are for vaccine forecasts, but you don't just do vaccines. How are you seeing pharma companies sort of refine their commercial forecasting?
Yeah, I think a lot of pharmaceutical companies got really taken back by some of the impact COVID had on in many of their areas, and their commercial forecasting turned out to not be super accurate. I think there's a real potential to rethink how the whole commercial forecasting is done and do much more kind of epi-based, bottom-up, also science-based views where you can actually do quite accurate probabilities estimates for market share, market size, rather than the traditional method where you looked at, how much did we sell in this country last year? You ask your country manager, what do you think you can sell this year? And how big do you think the market is? And then you might call IQVIA and you get some data, which often isn't very accurate. I think this is such a critical data point for the pharmaceutical companies. This drives where you allocate resources and a lot of other things. So I think there is a chance now also using these alternative data sources. So we plug into all kinds of thousands of different data sources to understand what is the real epi level, what is the disease prevalence here, which is really the starting point. That is like the core demand driver. And then we build it from there. And those models, I think, have turned out to be very, very accurate in not just COVID, but in many other areas. I think that's a way forward.
Maybe I can comment on it. There's a good saying which says, all forecasts are wrong, except some are useful. Typically it's the word model use, but you can apply it to forecasts. And I really very much like what Rasmus here said, is essentially that you have to change how these forecasts are made, especially in an R&D situation where you want to go into new indications, where there's no data you can lean on into. It's very important to get into these epi contexts and think about how you can apply into new indications, where really true forecasts are happening.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to go for questions. We don't have that much time because we want to eat lunch, obviously. Who wants to ask a question there? I shouldn't have mentioned lunch because now no one. There we are, over there. Someone will come and give you a mic in 2 seconds. Oh, over there. Okay, and then this one.
Hi, good afternoon. Lauren Bataille from Novartis. So thanks so much. What a great panel. It's great to see leaders who are supporting all these decentralized trial elements and innovations. I'm curious if you can share some of the tactics you use to kind of enable support from some of the folks who own the budgets for different aspects of the trials or for the commercialization, and to ensure that these tactics are actually being implemented, and perhaps also some of the KPIs that you're measuring within the organization to show value.
Okay, so I think we're probably only one person to take this. John, do you want to take it?
Oh, okay. And good to see you. I think if I were going to tackle it, we've described 58 KPIs we think are helpful for decentralized studies. They're not sort of your typical ones you do in a clinical trial. They're a little more segmented. And typically we have is if a customer's early on, there's sort of the key 9 that we say, here's the 9 we would recommend you focus on. And a lot of these are, once you actually get insights from the patient, this, and you bring that into the study, and then they tell you how to think about this, those R&D teams see that and go, oh, you're right, I shouldn't rinse and repeat and copy my protocol. And so I think a lot of it starts there. That's where we're really seeing the most amount of movement in R&D. But I would also say that in the R&D piece, the training piece, not the tech piece, it's the training. The training, we keep learning. We're not as good at training as we think we are, and we keep trying to make it better every week for 6.5 years straight. And so what I would say is the training of the R&D team and the education to understand how this works, what it does and what it doesn't do, seems to be the unlock that we're finding for customers to move it forward. So it's this, again, this perceptional risk, not the actual risk that we tend to run into.
Okay, there was one more lady there, question. And of course, you can bother any of the panelists at lunch.
Hi, Christy Yang from Novartis as well. My question is, just recently, Google have some challenges regarding the ethical AI. And it's exciting to see a lot of the opportunities and things that can bring up with the AI, but just wondering from a healthcare perspective, for example, like trial, now we are just, starting to have more diversity and things like that. So now, as we are starting to adapt more of the AI in healthcare, how can we make sure, to kind of like have that factor of social, like the general public perceptions, right? The stereotypes and some of those data things, like, when we're just, even just like summarizing the data and strategic wise, how can we also have that human side to kind of like look at the data and also see like, are we validating that?
Frank, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that. I mean, first you have to put AI into perspective. And I liked also what Rasmus said. For us, it's like AI is just one lab member around the table or one clinician around the table. So it's really this conversation between human intelligence and artificial intelligence, which is very important. The other thing is that you really have to explain and be absolutely after any biases, either in your data set, which often, in statistics, you call this a confounder. In sort of lay terms, it's more like, you explain it as a bias. But you really have to be absolutely clear about any confounders which are driving your data. And this is, for example, the whole discussion we had all morning about diversity in clinical trials is so important, so that the trial results you get out of it are really representative of all society and that everybody can benefit. And the final thing I would like to say is that there's a hope, a glimmer of hope at the horizon, that these typically black box models, which machine learning, artificial intelligence, you get a training data set, you get a result, that you can turn this into what is called explainable AI, so that you can actually look into this box and understand what is driving the signal you're getting. And if you can do this, then you can actually then see, is this a signal which is driven by an underlying bias or a confounder, or is this something which is independently creating a new ground truth, which is what we're all after.
Yeah, I mean, that was a really great question. Thank you for asking it, and thanks for answering, because I think it's nice to end on a note where we're not only hopeful about what AI could do to the industry, but also for the patient in a really ethical way. So thank you all so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.